Hello and welcome. I'm Orla Farrell and I'm delighted to bring you to this special event as part of National Biodiversity Week. Our talk with Aidan French, To the Rescue, Tree Staking and Ensuring Healthy Growth. And thank you so much to the Tree Council of Ireland for looking after us this morning. Good morning, Siobhan. Siobhan
Morning,
is
Orla.
the
Morning, Aidan.
administrator of the Tree Council, and we have with us Aidan French. So, Aidan is an expert in this field whose career spans over 4 decades in landscape architecture, from urban forestry to green infrastructure, most recently with Dún Laoghaire-Rathdown County Council in Dublin. Aidan, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Orla, for the opportunity to contribute and have a chat about this very important topic. Yeah.
Let's start with the most common question that we get in Easy Treesie, and that is, do we have to stake bare root trees that are shorter than I am, let's say, just a few years old, straight out of the nursery?
The short answer is yes. You'll recall we actually did some work last year up in Kilturn and we staked trees. So yes, I mean, I just maybe to go back to first principles, we have to remind ourselves that establishing trees, and particularly in an urban setting or even in rural, I mean, the definition of urban by the CSO in Ireland, the Central Statistics Office, is any residential group of people or more than 5,000 people. So you could get a large urban or village, which you could call urban. But anyway, the point is that we're taking trees out of their, trees don't naturally do what we do with them. We take them up or we take them in from a nursery garden centre and we're putting them into, the simplest way to probably explain is to think of a child or a toddler, take them out of, that's not their natural habitat. So we do need to support them. So there is a very simple ethical philosophy which was written into the Dún Laoghaire-Rathdown County Council 10-year urban forestry strategy, which I can come back to later. But it's a very simple, practical philosophy. Trees are our fellow creatures on the planet. Let's care for them. It's an ethical philosophy. It's very simple. In fact, they've been around a lot longer than us. So we need to nurture them and we need to have what I would call a cohabitation ethic. We're living together with them. So the answer is yes. And then you get into the detail, the technical detail. Why do you need them? And they still need to move in the wind, by the way, because the science, and I've just been reading some more papers, they need to move so that the root system develops robustly and then can support the tree. Just as children need to do with the ups and downs of life, as we raise them, but they need to learn to fall and get up and all that. So if you think of those very simple terms, we do need to stake them, and we need to do it in a way that is based on best professional arboricultural practice. So one recommendation, and there will be a list of sources of further reading, the Arboricultural Association in the UK provides a lot of really good technical advice, and it's actually not just directed at professional foresters or arborists or landscape architects. There's some really good infographics, and I was just looking at today to what I would call amateur planters, or there's been an upsurge, fantastic upsurge in the number of tree NGOs in Ireland, not just in the Republic, in the North as well. So yeah, we do need them, and it's how we do it. And I think with the younger trees, you're basically talking about slim stakes. It tends to be rubber ties, and we'll come back to that business of materials later in the chat.
Thank you very much, Aidan. Now, what are the most common mistakes that you've seen in amateur staking, like incorrect tie tension or over-reliance on stakes? We had a conversation about this sometime last year, I think it was, where I pointed out where I'm walking around and come across sometimes trees that look like they're being strangled by the ties wrapped around them. It could be a rubber tie.
Yeah, you can have a lot of fun with this. I've seen some very interesting things out there. And, I know our focus today is on planting done by wonderfully well-intentioned NGOs. I'm a member of my own Ray Tidy Towns, and there's great work going on. But I think a lot of what I'm seeing is to probably 2 or 3 factors, and it's not all attributable to amateur planting. We won't get into that today, what the councillors are doing. A lot of what I'm seeing around is really inexcusable delinquency. But I've seen funny things. Like I can tell you exactly where it is. I'm not going to name the exact street, but up in Ballantyre, I've seen like amateur carpentry. But
Mm.
people they see a stake or a tree might have been removed. The tree's been there several years, and they think, oh, the stake always has to have a tree in perpetuity till the day it dies, right? No, most tree stakes are only required for the first 18 to 24, the first two growing seasons, typically,
Mm.
depending on the tree and the size of the tree. I think I'm right in saying, Orla, and correct me if I'm wrong, a lot of amateur groups would not be planting semi-mature trees. They're not planting, and
No.
just to be technical for a second, the way trees are produced, and there's a British standard to how they're propagated and grown in the nurseries, and then they're sold according to the girth of the tree in 2 centimeter increments, starting 8 to 10, 10 to 12 standard trees, so lollipop trees. And again, that's not how trees grow, but a lot of trees are planted as standards. There's other ways of planting trees, as you've done, whips and transplants, which is the more natural approach. But the mistakes I've seen are, it's not so much maybe in what's being used, although that's questionable. I've seen excessive use of materials, which gets you into cost, that's rather inefficient use of money. I've seen a very heavy timbers used. I've seen the stakes left on too long, which is another question. And really, there's a lot of effort going into tree planting at the moment. And I was only reading this 10 minutes before we started this webinar from the Arboricultural Association, saying like the process. It's a process. Tree establishment. It's probably better to talk about establishing trees rather than tree planting, because the
Right.
planting is only the first stage, isn't it? Of course,
Mm.
and then you do the support, and then you have the aftercare, and that's where a lot of us fall down, I think. Particularly the weather we've had recently, young trees need watering as well. I'm a member of the Native Woodland Trust. We have a
Mm.
wonderful nursery in Trooperstown between Lara and Animo and the wonderful county of Wicklow, the Garden County. We have regular volunteers. There's calls out in the WhatsApp group every week or so from Jeremy Casey, the wonderful manager. And someone drop down and water the young trees. So let's not, we are talking about stake and support, but let's use the word support more broadly. It's support in the general and aftercare,
Mhm.
including weed control. So there
I'm
you are.
delighted you mentioned the watering, hearing in the news
Mm,
that we've had
yeah,
a record dry year and with hose pipe bans that were induced only this
exactly.
week, in fact, in three different areas. So I remind people that we like to use the grey water if we can and the rain.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah,
Water harvesting is a
for
big
this.
thing now. Yeah. Most people have water barrels. I have one here. It's great. They're so easy to install. Yeah.
Mm, mm. Thank you. So now bamboo and recycled plastics. What stake and tie materials would you recommend, Aidan, for different scenarios? And how can we balance cost, sustainability,
Mm.
and function?
Great question. And I'm thinking of my grandfather here. Why am I thinking of my granddad Joe? So my granddad was the man who got me into horticulture, and he used to use raffia. Sorry. Yeah, so natural materials. And before we came on in preparation for this webinar, there's actually quite a lot of materials out there which are not plastic based, they're not carbon based.
Mhm.
They are using things like jute.
Jute.
You mentioned that jute, yeah, and again, this information will be issued later to the audience and anyone who's interested where to get. There are suppliers of.
Mm.
I mean, by all means, the most common is the rubber tie, and the rubber block. But again, we're back to the earlier question. This is all connected. They do tend to be left on the trees too long.
Mm.
Sometimes, to go back to your earlier question, the mistakes. Sometimes the trees are tied too tightly and they
Mm.
can't move. And it was that they need to move. I remember reading a research paper years ago in the 80s about the cambium layer. It's not just that the trees need to move so the root system builds up, but the actual tissues in the tree need to be able to build up. So if you're strangling a tree, it's not going to happen. But
Mm.
there is a whole question. This is a very important issue because it tips into the circular economy, of course. And there's the materials you're using, and there are nature-based materials. There, like jute-based materials. You'll sometimes see, I've seen them in Dublin city centre where recent public realm schemes done by landscape architects, they're using these if you go down Clarendon Street, for example, recently, beautiful new trees within hard landscaping.
Mm.
So that's the professional approach. Amateurs can adopt those and look at those as well. So there's the material itself, but then there's the other, again, into the aftercare. We can reuse rubber ties. There's no reason why they cannot be reused. If they're carefully removed, the rubber blocks can certainly be removed. The ties sometimes get it can be awkward to take them off. But there's different designs. Some of them are kind of louvered into each other. Um, yeah. So, but you're raising very important questions which are practically orientated, and it's an opportunity in some ways, maybe for the amateur movement, can we call it, to show a lead to other actors in tree establishment. There you go.
And Aidan, you have actually brought to mind some stand of trees where they have been staked. I'm quite sure for about the last 10 years. I must take a walk by them now.
Yeah, just a very quick one. Sorry to interrupt you. Just on the stake, you will see, and they tend to be used for smaller trees, and they're square section. So they're square stakes, and they're no more than 25 centimeter, or an inch or maybe an inch and a half. The only difficulty I see with them is because they're square, they've sharp corners. So, a child at 10 could tell you, well, that could be a problem because the tree's rubbing up. So it's preferable, in my opinion, to use round stakes. And you will get round stakes in a similar diameter, in 2 or 3 inch or 4. They tend to go up in 50 millimeters is 2 inches. So I'll work on both. I do old money on new money. So in inches, you're typically talking about 2.5 inch, 3 inch for the smaller trees. So that's 50 millimeters is 2 inches. 75 millimeters is 3 inches. You only really start having to use 4 inch, 100 millimeter diameters for the larger trees, the 8 to 10. But a lot of what I think Easy Trees you're planting and other organizations like Cran and that they're planting whips and transplants, and where that actually started, slight diversion, but the use of small, whips and transplants, which are typically, as 45 centimeters to 60, 18 to 2 inches to 2 feet. That came out of Warrington Runcorn in England in the 80s and the 70s, and from the Netherlands, when professional landscape architects and parks managers started doing motorways. And in the new towns in England, like Warrington Runcorn, I've been there, mass planting. I mean, you have a question here about scale planting and orchards and so on. They realized and this again is back to the science, because again, to use the analogy of a child, a child moves from school, you're a former teacher, this, there's a transplant shock. The 5-6-year-olds left the house and now there's tears. And then even we adapt. Like the trees, we have a lot in common. We've evolved to be adaptable species. Maybe not the wisest of species. I joke, Homo sapiens. What other species decides don't habitat? But the point is that there is a transplant shock, and obviously the shock is less the younger the tree is. So if you try and transplant a root ball tree, and it also gets into species specific, things like birch are not as adaptable. Beech trees like willow and poplar and so on, they don't mind it, and they love water, of course. But so it's better to plant young, and this is what they discovered. So in the 1980s, Dublin County Council Parks Department was seconded, staff were seconded to work on all the motorway schemes into the 90s and then into the early 2000s. So a lot of the landscape planting you saw, I'm talking hectares of planting on. I mean, I worked on a 12-kilometer motorway, the Southeastern Motorway, which people would know is the final section of the M50. That's all whips and transplants, like what you guys plant. And a lot of them, they weren't staked at all. They're not staked. I mean, it would have been crazy. The cost of stake. I mean, the budget for the Southeastern Motorway, the landscape budget, was about $1.25 million. But the point is, the research from particularly the Netherlands and then into England in the 80s, there's a guy called Alan Ruff, that was taken up and applied as a scale planting of whips and transplants and feathered maidens. And the advantages of that as well. And I was looking at Treesie in Marley Park, where they've done beautiful copse, not standard trees. I mean, a lot of us kind of get tired of looking at standard trees. They're artificial objects in a way, and trees aren't objects. But it's necessary because of cities and the way we design cities. But there is scope and space for copse planting, for planting trees as whips in a group. Mitchell and Associates, the landscape architects, started doing this way back, where it's kind of a cheat. You buy a number of whips, put them together, and they look like a copse. And then if they are hazel, then you can actually coppice them. So it introduces a more naturalistic and and because of the whole shift among both the experts and non-experts into this ecological thinking that's more nature-based, it's more appealing in many ways. And it's appealing visually in terms of biodiversity, and it's also easier to get the trees established in that manner.
I'm very glad to hear that, Aidan, because that's really what we're doing now, and we're up to over 700,000 saplings planted around the country in just these settings. for the most part. And you were talking about the large scale planting there, like school orchards. We have occasionally treated our high performing groups with a little prize of some bare root orchard
Mm,
trees. Are there nature-based alternatives to staking, like strategic grouping, as you just mentioned, or nurse species that can reduce
mm.
labour and waste?
That I'm aware of, but as I said earlier, I mean, a lot of this is around common sense. Well, the
Mm,
thing about common sense is it's always so common. But no, it's a good question. I'm not aware of any particularly innovative. I am familiar with the term. Most of us would be of nurse crops, you know, and windbreaks and that kind of thing of, you know, using trees, say like alder, birch, mountain ash, that are not the climax species like the oak and so on.
mm,
They're very well capable of standing up, generally speaking, to hostile conditions, particularly in urban areas. I think we need to also, and this is a separate topic, but it's important just to mention it for a few seconds. One of the things that does concern me, and this is not a negative criticism of the amateur movement or tidy towns, but I have noticed a certain zealotry among
mm,
people who say, "Oh, they have to be native trees." You know, again, back to the research, and I was at the World Urban Forum on urban forestry in Washington
mm,
D.C. in October 2023. Five
mm,
months before that, I was in Krakow, Poland, at the European Forum on urban forestry. Brilliant PhD research papers, all kinds of topics on tree equity, on some of the things we're discussing today as well. But one of the things, and it's research, I think, out of Germany, the Netherlands, is that some of our natives cannot handle the climate change that are coming.
mm,
Some of them are struggling. So
mhm,
if I was able to take out the patio here, I have a beautiful ginkgo. So, you
mhm,
know, ginkgo is a very special tree. In my book, it's very, very deeply, both philosophically and spiritually in many ways. It survived the nuclear bombings in August 45.
mhm.
Um, ginkgo handles urban tree pollution and urban conditions very well. And all
Really?
over Berlin, Potsdamer I mean, I've been in Europe a lot in cities in recent years, and
Mm,
we're behind the curve here. They're also planting magnolias. We don't have a lot of evergreen trees in Ireland. I don't mean conifers, evergreen
mm.
broadleaves, particularly for street and public planting. They're
It's
using
true.
all kinds of things that we haven't thought about, maidenhair trees. So it's not an either or. I mean, this is not a binary but I have, and it's just a friend of mine just won't listen to the expert advice. The biodiversity officers who are ecologists, I'm not an ecologist, they'll tell you it's like, you know, we cannot be absolute about these things. We have to adapt to the research. So there is a role for trees that are native and here thousands of years, but I mean, the pearl sycamore gets a bad press. Very
Mm,
good for atmospheric pollution. That came with the Normans. Our family are Norman, family animal background. I mean, when do you finally become native? You know?
mhm,
So let's be pragmatic with this stuff, I think. But yeah. So coming back to the school orchards, which is great, and I've seen orchards not just in schools. I've seen one in Crossway Park Dunleary, which is done with the local residents association. Here in Bray, there's a wonderful edible corridor on the famous Albert Walk, which has some trees, and it's opposite cafes and restaurants, and they're using the produce. So I think we do need to, in Wexford in the 60s or 70s, they planted a lot of trees on the roads, the county council, and they're still there, apples. So they don't really require a nurse. What they do require is a bit of patience and care. They don't really require nurse planting as far as I can see, but I could be wrong.
Well, I'm delighted to hear you mention the sycamore. I have one
Yeah,
here behind me.
I
I'm
can
here
see
on
it.
the
Yeah.
Cooley Peninsula. Yes. And actually, my two daughters have violins made out of sycamore, made in the 1800s.
Way. Wow.
So, uh, and
Yeah.
the beekeepers like it.
Yeah.
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 I mean, you do have to watch they don't take over. But
Yeah.
here in Cooley, we actually have a parade of pines and that we planted
Mm,
here along the shores of Carlingford Lough. And in this part of the world, Corsican pine was planted in
yeah.
big numbers and really thrives. So we donated to Corsican pine. We a lot of the Corsican pine now has been blown down. Like they were all planted
Mm,
around the same time, I believe. So I mistakenly got Pinus nigra instead of Pinus nigra, or the other way around. So we ended up with
Artemia,
two
yeah, that does well
Austrian
for the
pines at
sea.
the prom.
Yeah. Mm.
Then, yeah, because of that little slip,
Mm.
then we added two Corsican pines, maybe 2 years later, and we've added three Scots pines. So we've a bit of a parade of
There you
pines.
go. Yeah, yeah.
But just like that, in the teeth of the storms that we get here off Carlingford
Mm.
Lough, the Corsican pine and Austrian pine has been they're great for shelter, and
I,
we
yeah, yeah.
obviously there was a mix. Like we've a lot of white beam, we've a lot of I have a little oak here behind me that's in my nursery outside, and
Well,
uh,
more power to you. I know the Carlingford. I'm in a hiking club, and we go up to Carlingford at least once a year. I'll keep an eye out for your pines. But
I'm wondering about poor staking and does it affect uh, trees' resilience, do you know, decades later, like susceptibility to storms and disease factors? And can you correct these in adulthood?
probably no. It's a well framed question. Decades later, I don't know. I mean,
Mm.
I have seen. I mean, not far from here, like 10 minutes drive down the road to the Carrick Pines Retail Centre. I did a video recently. I've seen birch trees badly staked, and again, stakes left on it where they've rubbed up very badly. I see this a lot and damaged the bark. And of course, they're wound entries for pathogens,
Right.
potentially. So
Mhm.
conceivably, your question is well framed, you know. I mean, most people would go, yeah, will this, let's say the kindest word we could say is
Mm.
it's suboptimal. It's not even
Optimal.
to do with idea. It's just not, it's not, we're letting ourselves down if we treat trees in that way. And it's
Mm.
also very foolish in terms of cost. I mean, the trees I was looking at were actually, they were planted actually lovely, as we were saying
Mm.
earlier, as a multi-stem composition.
Mm.
They were probably planted as, you know, feather maidens in a group. And you're looking at, I'm guessing now, rough ballpark, several €100 between labor materials to do that. And now if I took you down there today, I actually did a
Mm.
comparative analysis, not scientifically, a
Mm.
visual. And there are methodologies for assessing the quality of trees will be applied by arboricultural consultants. So there is a science around this. But just at a simple level, yeah, the tree's health has been compromised, possibly its lifespan, but certainly its immediate health and the opportunistic offer now for a pathogen, whether it's a fungus, and there are more pests and diseases moving in as well because of
Mm.
climate change. You're
Mm.
opening up wounds. You know, it's very simple. You
Mm.
plant a tree in your garden and you don't take care of it, or you damage it. You know, or a
Mm.
mower. Another common thing you will see is it's to do with maybe someone rushing a job, flying around a mowing machine, a contractor, and there's
Oh.
trees and they
Mhm.
damage the bark. And actually, it is a very serious matter if it's a roadside tree. If you think about it, you know, if a tree is compromised and it's planted in a roadside verge, whether it's a residential street, a service road, or, you know, an arterial road within a town or a village, um, it's quite possible the tree stability would be. I mean, we had a tree came over on the road here in the estate. I've been in an estate called Swanbrook and Bray, don't mind saying,
Mhm.
off the Southern Cross route. The population of Bray is 35,000. There's more houses being built, which is great. But on the entrance road in here, narrow verge, trees probably planted as bare root. 1996, 97, that's when the estate was occupied. We all
Mhm.
moved in. A tree keeled over. Now, it might have been vandalized. I'm not sure because I know some of the trees, looking at them over the years, have been damaged at base level, down at the lower part of the trunk, severely damaged. I mean,
Mm.
I had to phone the council because the tree was falling out over the road
Mm.
within about 12 meters of the junction with the major road. So the driver comes around and there it is immediately
Mm.
as a risk. So this is a risk hazard. I won't labor the point, but I think it's a very good question. And it's back to what we said at the beginning, this ethical philosophy of taking care of trees, respecting them as fellow creatures. You know, that's a very simple thing, but it has practical application in terms of how you design them in. And you're very familiar, and most people are. They remember the first two phrases in the phrase, the advisory phrase, the right tree in the
Mm.
right place. But the latter two, which I've only heard a few years ago, what's his name? Alan, I think it's Alan Simpson. He's a very well known senior landscape architect. He was my in the UK, and I met him in Krakow. He or someone else added on the final part, which is okay, the right tree in the right place, rightly planted, which is what we're talking about today, planted in
Mhm.
the right way, staked and supported for the right reasons, not just because you want a tree there because it'd be nice. There's a kind of a very simple algorithm you go through in your head. There's a quality decision making and how you decide that that tree, that species or variety should be in that place. Is it
Mhm.
to screen something? It can even be for one beneficial reason. It could be multiple reasons. But with all the enthusiasm in tree planting, I think it's great that someone like you is willing to learn from the science and your supporters and your allies. So it's a dialogue between the professional people like myself, former colleagues, and and all these what Michael D calls our president active citizens. And you've met
Mhm.
the man, I know.
Our
So
patron. Exactly.
exactly, yeah.
Exactly.
He
Oh,
would
yeah.
he would admire and recognize not to get too high minded, but there's a certain honor in because we had this during COVID where experts, I don't mean me, experts were dismissed,
Mm.
you know. So I think and Science Foundation in Ireland, and we have wonderful scientists in this country. So, but arboriculture, unfortunately, is a bit of a minority sport. We won't get into it today, but only 3 of the 31 local authorities have tree officers, and there's great ecologists as biodiversity officers. So there's great stuff going on. But the more we can learn from the latest tree science, particularly the impacts on tree selection, climate change, and I'll just mention one resource while I think of it, and then we can move on to the next question. There's a wonderful organization. It is a professionally based organization called TDAG. So that's the acronym TDAG, the Tree
Mm.
Design and Action Group.
Mhm.
So that's a collective or a collaboration between engineers. And the engineers, if you think of the two biggest professions that shape people's lives,
Mhm.
I run a small consultancy called Nature Based Placemaking.
Mhm.
Home place, your residential place. I don't talk about landscape much, okay? So people connect with the word place because if we all have a home place, we might have a workplace, which could be your home place as well, or recreational place. So the two most powerful professions that will be planners and engineers and architects. In England, the landscape architecture will be stronger. But those four, along with ecologists, so landscape architects, engineers, planners, and ecologists come together several years ago and they formed a group called the Tree Design Action Group. And they have brilliant guidance, freely available. They actually have a very large document, but it's quite well to put together. It's very easy to drill in. There's a whole matrix. There's like a spreadsheet at the back on tree selection. So I'll put that in the
Excellent.
resource list. But
Yes.
they are looking at key challenges, including things like we're talking about today. And their approaches will be very much evidence based. The evidence around coming from research, and then that informs best professional practice.
And you reminded me in your discussion of streamers and mowers, which are really
Mm.
our enemy number one if you don't count
Oh, they're
the
flying out the door of Woodies, I'm sure. They have their uses.
killers.
I mean,
Yes.
they're necessary, but it's how you use them. It's just, being careful and not rushing, we live such busy lives, I suppose. It's in the culture.
It
There
was
you go.
actually the school children on Tashka Green Schools Committee that
Yeah.
noticed out in Baldoyle where we had done one of our first little orchard plantings that we had strangled some of our new whips that had been
Mm,
put in only months, weeks before with red ribbons that we put on around Valentine's Day
mm.
to keep the strimmers and mowers away. But the red ribbon
Yeah, well, clever experiment.
choking the little trees. And it was a little boy
Yeah.
of 7 who came running up and said, Teacher, teacher, I have some bad news. So,
Yeah,
yes,
well, it's all about education and awareness, I
mhm,
suppose. Yeah.
mhm, it is. There was only one other thing I wanted to ask you, and then maybe if you had anything else to raise, you could
Hmm.
mention it, and that was beyond traditional stakes. Are there any emerging innovations like biodegradable supports or mycorrhizal treatments that could revolutionize how we establish young trees?
Well, biochar is one. It's not something I know I've had experience of using, but biochar is a natural
Right.
product that's being used increasingly.
Hmm.
You mentioned the mycorrhizal thing. So you and I think, are fans of the wonderful Canadian forest ecologist Suzanne Simard.
Yes.
And Suzanne actually, her book, no, I've got the other. So I think of them as together. So there's Peter Wolfenen, I think I
Or
have a whole
on
library
the
of
shelf?
books here and trees beside me. Don't worry, I'm not going to go to all 2,000 of them. But the likes of Suzanne Simard and this man, Peter Wolfman, and a lot of people are familiar with his work. So the heartbeat of trees, embracing our ancient bond with forest and nature.
Mm-hmm.
And his other book, which I think was his first, The Hidden Life of Trees. But Suzanne Simard is famous for a couple of things. And again, she comes out of a science background. The wood wide web, the mother tree,
Mm.
and the mycorrhizal connections. So she did research. I'd invite the audience, those of you who haven't heard of her, just do one thing: Google her and watch her TED talk. Oh gosh, it goes back, I think, at least 10 more years. She was actually isolated within her own profession, forest ecologist, initially because her work is dismissed as a bit harebrained, but it's not at all. Before I go, let me
Yeah.
share. Let me do this if I can remember what you. Yeah. So if I share the screen, I mentioned it a few times, the ethical philosophy. This is just an excerpt from a PowerPoint I gave actually to Tree Foundation Ireland. The Green Foundation Ireland, actually, the Green Foundation Ireland is a great organization. Now, it is connected with the Green Party in Europe and in Ireland. There's a European Green Foundation. They run brilliant seminars free on all kinds of topics, including the migrant crisis, housing, the circular economy, and so on, so on. But they did invite me to give a talk, and that's the cap. That's at one of the slides, and in there you'll see all these words starting with C. I
Mm-hmm.
just think, cohabitation, co-design, collaboration, co-decision
Mm-hmm.
making, all the stuff you're doing, Orla. It's all about, we live in a very individualistic culture, don't we? But I
And
think very
mm-hmm.
individual. So the whole sense of community and the social function. I was out with you guys, and there were people from companies, like forget who they were, and post who'd never met before, colleagues, work colleagues, but because they're working from home. Anyway, I won't show all of this. This is actually drawn from I don't know if they didn't incorporate everything. There was a final draft to the Doon 10-year forestry strategy, which the council is required to do under its Action 14 of Doon legally required climate
Mm-hmm.
action plan. Legally required because every local authority has to have a climate action plan and implement it. But this was a very simple philosophy I came up with. We will apply the philosophy of our own practices, this philosophy of trees as living organisms. So, like most things in life, that's not original. You can see there the reference. So, in the city, the great city of Lyon in France,
Mm-hmm.
they're onto their second tree charter. Now, again, look, they have a tree charter which brought all kinds of stakeholders. I forget the population of the grand metropole, the greater area of Lyon. It's a huge city. But they have a wonderful man there. His name should be on that. Anyway, he wrote this ethical philosophy, as I call it, about living organisms. So I can't claim credit for the original idea. I just adopted it. And then in the second piece here, you say this ethic will drive our shared collective responsibility. So the word shared collective responsibility is in there, or sorry, that phrase, those three words, is because the council, in preparing its tree strategy, we did focus groups. I'll go into that some other time if you like, but there were 5 focus groups, including 2 youth groups, one for disadvantaged youth. And a project arose out of that. And just the final slide here. So there's the project, and you'll see trees staked in this actually. So that is a community woodland in Ballybrack, not far from here, in Bray, only 20 minutes drive away. So you'll see very simple staking there. And this is an edible woodland in urban setting. It's only about 500 square meters. And that was done with local volunteers in the community officer. There's a whole story there we don't have time to go into, but you can see actually that's a fig tree there. So there's an exotic, non-native. There, and to the left, there's a birch. There's all kinds of stuff in there. There's herbaceous understory. So that photograph's out of date. Actually, it's established more than that. I mean, at this stage, you probably can't see that. That's actually, in terms of materials, palisade fencing to protect areas of small orchards that you were talking about earlier, or woodland. That's very useful, and it's nature. That's cleft chestnut pale fencing. It comes in 2 heights. 1.2 meters, 4 foot, or 1.5. That's used a lot. You'd see that in landscape planting schemes.
Oh,
It's not too
we love
expensive,
that.
and it can be
Yes.
taken down and rolled up again. You'll probably
Yes.
see it. Yeah. So
And around newly established woodlands, it's very effective against vandalism, apparently,
it is. Yeah, it is. If it's
because it's
well,
very hard to negotiate if you're.
yeah, if it's well installed. So there you go. That's it basically.
You, Aidan, that was so inspiring and so interesting. And I'm really delighted now to have these documents issued by the expert organisations that we'll be able to share with our community. And Siobhan, I'd like to thank Siobhan Quinn and yourself, Aidan French, for your company this morning. And I will say goodbye to everyone and wish you all a wonderful Biodiversity Week. And for more tips, planting guides and upcoming events, you can visit the Tree Council of Ireland, Crown and Easy Treesie websites. And thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Orla, and thank you everyone for watching. Hoping you got something out of it. Thank you. And thanks to Siobhan as well.
Not at all. You're very welcome.
Okay. Bye.
Okay.